This week we are going to talk about influence. The title of this week's topic is inspired by the book of the same name. I'll talk about this in a little bit. This week I will be getting caught up with week 6 feedback, and we'll talk about most of the feedback from week 7. I'll briefly go over modules 15 and 16, and I will talk about the activities for this week, week 8. So, catching up with week 6 feedback, looking at the written reflection from a couple weeks ago, I was really impressed with the way that you applied heuristics. I love that you incorporated heuristics into your discussion of critical thinking, that using your critical thinking skills can help prevent you from falling prey to heuristics. I also created a document that has a list of all of the definitions of critical thinking that you gave. As I mentioned, there aren't a lot of sources that talk about what critical thinking is. And so, in a sense, we're going to crowdsource the definition. There were a lot of similarities across your definitions, but none of them were identical. So I think it would be worth looking over that and seeing how some of your classmates define it. I did have some formatting suggestions for the table specifically. Overall, though, I will say I only have 3 suggestions here, and there are, I don't know, probably 2,000 things that you probably could do for formatting suggestions. So 3 out of 2,000 is excellent. So all of you did a great job formatting your tables. A couple things to look out for. One is to make sure that there's a space in between the number of your rating scale and the left parenthesis. So you want to make sure there's a space for the first number and space for the second number. Another thing you want to look for is, although what's inside the parentheses is italicized, the parentheses themselves are not. So they shouldn't look slanted. They should, aside from being curved, they shouldn't slant to the right or slant to the left. As far as the capitalization of the title and of the headers for the columns and the rows, the row and column titles are in title case, so all important words are capitalized. The only words that you wouldn't capitalize would be small unimportant words, things like and or the. Those type of words would not be capitalized, but everything else would be. And that's what I call title case, because it's like a title of a book where all the important words are capitalized. If you include a figure, then you'll label both the x and the y axes. So the x-axis is the horizontal axis, the y-axis is the vertical axis. If you have your scale from 0 to 5 or 1 to 5 on your y-axis, you want to make sure that you indicate what that scale represents. If it's confidence or use, if you are representing 2 different measures in one figure, so let's say you have a bar chart that has 2 different measures in it simultaneously, you can actually label the left side with one of the axes and the right side with the other. So you can Google that if you want to, something like double y-axes, and you might get some ideas there. Otherwise, you can just let me know if you have any questions further about that. Looking at quiz 6, overall everyone did a good job on quiz 6. I had some comments about the short answer question that was looking at Ash and Milgram's studies. I put up a couple examples here of some really good answers to the second part of that question. A lot of you mentioned differences in levels of authority as a reason why we saw differences in who was or was not defying the experimenter's instructions or were going against the norm, the group. So a lot of you mentioned authority. Some of you also mentioned some other things that I thought were pretty insightful. One of you mentioned the foot in the door phenomenon, that especially with the Milgram study, you're starting with this low voltage and then you work your way up. So that would be a great example of the foot in the door phenomenon. Well, I'm not going to say a great example, but academically it is an example of the phenomenon. The size of the group that you're in could also influence it. So if you're in a larger group, there might be more peer pressure. Some of you mentioned that the severity of the consequences would be larger in the Milgram experiment. Interestingly, both of those were inversely related. So although the Milgram experiment was hypothetically had bigger consequences, more negative consequences, that you are hypothetically injuring this person potentially as you're hearing them screaming from the next room, more people actually conformed or obeyed in Milgram's experiment than conformed in Ash's experiment. So great job with that. Online post number 6, I thought you did an excellent job connecting either the Ash or the Milgram study, or both in some instances, to current events or recent experiments that have been done. So great job there. Online post 6 actually had the highest average score of all the posts that you've had so far. So great work. I want to give you thorough feedback on your proposal outlines, so I'll have those to you later this week. I won't have them for you today. But I'm going to give you a lot of feedback on those. It might look like I'm tearing it apart, but I glanced over them and you are definitely on the right track. You're making good progress, and I just want to make sure to point out things to look out for as you're working forward. Moving on to Module 15, which talks about persuasion. As I mentioned, this week is based off of this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's first written in 1936, but it's held up really well. So you can see there, this is actually an audiobook, the 75th version, or 75th anniversary collector's edition. A lot of what it says is still true today. Some of the suggestions in this book can be applied to the topic of persuasion. Module 15 talks about the elaboration likelihood model that's created in 1986 by Petty and Cacioppo that explains 2 ways in which people's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors can be influenced. One of Carnegie's suggestions, appealing to the nobler motives of people, reflects an influence strategy that's consistent with the central route to persuasion, which is one of the 2. That strategy requires the audience to be able to and to be motivated to think about their ethics. So they're actually thoughtfully considering the message. Another suggestion in the book, to dramatize your ideas, reflects an influence strategy that's more consistent with a peripheral route to persuasion. You'd be more likely to influence someone who is less able and less motivated to think about your message by eliciting an emotional response with a dramatic example of your idea. So let's look at the different routes in a little more detail. As we go through the routes to persuasion, think about some experiences that you've had recently. Have people that you know or things that you've seen, maybe an ad on TV, try to persuade you of something. So think about experiences that correspond with each of the 2 routes to persuasion, with the peripheral route to persuasion and with the central route to persuasion. So I'm going to talk about the peripheral route to persuasion first. As I mentioned, this is more effective when the audience member doesn't necessarily have the ability or doesn't have the motivation to think about your message content. It tends to use heuristics and other rules of thumb, more automatic processes rather than more intentional, effortful processing. So cues like attractiveness of the communicator, the person that's giving you the message, and the authority of the communicator can influence this in the peripheral route. So a model being a spokesperson for something, that would be the attractiveness component. If you ever are talking about any kind of medical product, you typically have somebody wearing a lab coat, which gives you that indication of authority, which also is similar to Milgram's experiment, as some of you mentioned. The length of the argument can also have a factor. So if you have a really long argument, then someone might think, well, if it's really long, it must be true. Basically, you just wear them down. Emotional reactions, especially fear and happiness, are also related to peripheral persuasion. If any of you have seen the ads with Sarah McLachlan singing in the background, I don't know if it's the ASPCA, it's some animal charity, and there's this very sad music playing in the background. It's definitely designed to elicit sadness or concern, similar to the image on the right there that's looking at polar bears and whether or not their environment is going to last. So this is frequently used in TV ads because when we're watching TV, we're not usually intending to really think hard about a message. We're just passively consuming information. The central route, on the other hand, is effective when someone does have the ability and the motivation to think about message content. They tend to use cues like logic and the strength of the argument. So nothing really about what it looks like or how it sounds, but the real content of the argument is what matters for the central route to persuasion. Some examples might be ads for technology, like a computer ad, where they're talking about different components. So it's not just, hey, this computer looks pretty great. It's, this is the speed that it processes. This is how much memory it has. So they're giving you actual numbers that you can use to compare and contrast with other products. Another example would be a political debate, originally designed so that the political candidates could tell you what their stance is. So they can tell you what their logic is for their political standing, and that can convince you that they have a logical argument, that they are thoughtful, and then you would be more likely to want to vote for them. If you saw an ad for a computer that was, like I said, just promoting its experience, that would be more the peripheral attempt at persuasion. But if you're looking at the function, and with this ad here, you can see there are a lot of words there, so it's not just looking at the appearance of something, it's actually talking about the content. And change with the central route is more long-lasting. It's more resistant to change, and it's more predictive of behavior through the central route. However, the peripheral route, on the other hand, is more temporary because you're looking at that emotional aspect of it. And I'm briefly going to talk about Module 16. As you're reading through this, I want you to pay attention to the characteristics of each of the three components, the communicator, the message, and the audience, that are described in Module 15, that also is carried over, some components of that, in Module 16, talking about indoctrination. So make sure that you are able to link those two things together across those two modules. I wanted to talk specifically about the inoculation section because I think it's the most relevant and most important for you, and for people in general right now. They talk about inoculation as being sort of a vaccine. It's like a preventative measure that keeps you from being persuaded by false messages. Specifically, the last paragraph on page 193 of the book briefly presents three critical approaches that would help you resist false messages without also making it likely that you would resist a valid or a true message. So as you read through that section, think about the messages that you've received lately, and how would you take those three steps? So what would that look like in your situation with the messages that you've received? So looking to this week, for week 8, check out the feedback from earlier activities, weeks actually 6 and 7 feedback. Online post 7 will be related to the elaboration likelihood model and potentially information from modules 15 and 16. So I'd like you to identify 2 unique messages that you've heard recently. One message that was more likely to be processed through your peripheral route and one through your central route. And then talk about characteristics of those messages. What were the characteristics that led you to categorize them as either peripheral or central? And then talk about how effective those messages were and what was it about those messages that was or was not effective. I will get you your group project outline feedback back to you by the end of this week, so you can be working on the group project paper draft. I don't have an official due date for that, but I would strongly encourage you, if you are able, to turn in a rough draft that is written out in sentences in week 12, and I can give you early feedback on that. I think it can potentially help a lot for your final draft. And then exam 2 will cover readings from last week till the beginning. It is, again, 50 points. There are 45 multiple choice questions. Those are worth 1 point each. As some of you mentioned in the mid-course survey, you want to make sure that those aren't weighted too heavily. There are 2 short answer questions, and with the other assessments, you can take it up to 2 times by Sunday midnight. Next week, which would be week 9, but it is spring break, I would request that you do no work for this class next week. So things are due Sunday at midnight. Starting Monday at 12:01, I would encourage you to not do any work. Studies have shown that having that break from work can help you be rested and recharged when you come back. It's important. So definitely take that mental break. I will post the next set of materials Monday, March 13th, which is basically the same day that I usually post things in the week. So we talked about feedback, went over the feedback for you, and gave you a brief introduction to modules 15 and 16, and talked about what we'll be doing this week. And a reminder to enjoy your spring break next week.